Welcome to the Infernal Brotherhood's Willow series. Today I'm continuing my live reading of Shadow Moon by Chris Claremont and George Lucas, Book 1 of the Willow sequel trilogy, Chronicles of the Shadow War. We'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel for more Willow content and like and share this video. Farron struck hard, shoulder first, that impact costing him his hold on the knife, which Thorn immediately kicked out over the edge of the scar, but came up quickly nonetheless, favoring his sore side but determined to continue the fight. He bared his teeth, and it was as though Thorn had been shot through the breast. The boy had long fangs, creating the impression that the death dog's teeth had replaced his own. When Farron flexed his fingers, out sight caught the gleam of claws where human nails once had been. What had been illusion with Thorn, when he took on the aspect of a death dog, was reality for the boy. "Farron!" Thorn pleaded. "No!" A waste of breath. He knew that when he spoke. The boy sprang expectantly, expecting Thorn to try to duck away somehow. Instead, the Nelwyn stood his ground and caught Farron's hand in his own. The boy snapped his teeth, trying for Thorn's throat, but Thorn had a slight advantage in the arm length and put it to good use, pushing up and away, stretching Farron's arm to full extension. There was blood in the boy's breath, the stale smell of lives gleefully taken. He was screaming as well. Might have been words, or more likely, his equivalent of the gabbling noises his hounds made. Thorn was beyond listening. He knew there was no hope, a foregone conclusion the moment Farron had tasted blood, tasted death, but he turned the full force of his insight on the boy regardless, praying to find some small remnant of the lad he'd brought into the world a decade ago. As he did so, his fingers tightened their grip, his hands began to twist, forcing the boy's down to his knees, where he couldn't bring his legs around to strike out with them. The boy's struggle became more frantic as he finally realized his plight, but he'd had better luck trying to break a set of iron manacles than the Nelwyn's hold. It was a common misconception. To most, especially among the Daikini, size and strength went together. Lack one, you had to lack the other, especially when the odd proportions of Nelwyns were thrown into the mix. In Thorn's case, folks saw a figure that barely reached a grown man's hips, and according to a child's ability to go with its stature. Little notice was taken of the breadth of his chest and the power of his arms, and shoulders was generally mistaken for the bulk of his clothes. In the right circumstances, he was a match and more for those 3 times his size. Thorn bent the boy more and more, until at last, and with an awful crack, Farron's back broke. It was like slicing the strings on a puppet. All the tension fled from the boy's body, and he collapsed to the ground, little more than a collection of sticks. He wasn't yet dead. His eyes moved. His mouth still worked. He made no sound, though, for his lungs had lost the capacity to draw in air, as had his heart the ability to beat. Thorn dropped beside him, gathering the boy gently into his lap, as though he were handling a piece of the finest porcelain. There was only blind hatred in Farron's eyes, the lust of the death dog eager for its kill, and his teeth made a feeble clack sound as he brought them together as hard as he was able in vain attempt to draw more of Thorn's blood. Dying as he was, the boy remained true to the nature that had been grafted onto his soul. It was more than Thorn could bear, far more than the boy should have to, and so he swept insight about the pair of them and cast his spirit face to face with Farron's. The boy was broken in his soul as well, a mirror to his corporeal state, the radiance that was his life dimming with every passing moment. Thorn had thought that here, at least, he'd find a last vestige of Farron's existence, but all that lay before him was the shape of a death dog amidst the shattered remnants of its feast. The boy's human soul, every part of him that was decent, had been utterly consumed. Such was the way of things with death dogs. Stories abound as to how they were creations of the foulest sorcery. Like all such tales, this one had some truth to it. The hounds themselves were animal, creatures of flesh and blood and bone and sinew, just like those they hunted. The leader of a hunting pack, however, had to be human and embrace this abominable path as an active choice, someone willing to cast off all that separated 2 legs from 4, most especially humanity, in return for the power and passion that went with running with the death dogs. It wasn't true, shape-shifting, the few shapers Thorn had met were by and large honorable folk, but a deliberate and malefic twisting of something decent, a corruption of the flesh to complement that of the spirit. Thorn took the phantom beast by its throat and peeled away the layers of its memory to determine who had brought it into being and to this place. The images came easily, a pathway he was meant to follow, leading to a maze-like catacomb of the soul that was enshrouded by a darkness the like of which he'd never known. There was no true light here. Thorn found his perceptions defined by degrees of shadow, and his expression tightened it. How naturally the ancient word for evil came to mind. Physically, Farron had been taken by force. Thorn felt resonances of riders and dark and deadly at this vault in the boy's memory. But he'd accepted the change spell willingly, without question, without hesitation. No true sense remained of the sorcerer responsible. Both face and spirit were wholly cloaked. Only the boy's reaction to him were there to be read, and they were wholly at odds with what had happened. Farron had been unafraid, certain to his core that this was someone who would never do him harm. It was a deception as absolute as the boy's faith. He was told that evil was good and so embraced it with all his heart. To his final moment, he never realized how he'd been totally betrayed. The spirit hound uttered a growl that might have been a laugh of triumph at the Nelwyn's inability to save yet another that he loved, and Thorn cast the last scraps of radiance from the haunted place and put out its light forever. When he looked again through his own physical eyes, there was no movement to the boy's body, and his eyes had lost their luster. Thorn closed the lids and gathered the child's head close to his breast, rocking back and forth in tune to his heartbeat, wishing for tears from eyes that had long ago gone dry, wanting to howl like a man demented, yearning with passion that frightened him for the power to repay this murder 1,000-fold and bring to the creature responsible such pain and more as he felt now. The walk back to camp was an interminable slog. He didn't worry about the details. He focused on placing one foot before the other, content that eventually he reached a destination. The carnage should have shocked him. There were bodies everywhere, death dogs skewered or decapitated or outright burned, too many of those for the fire to properly handle. It had been reduced to smoldering coals, the pile on top charred meat. The stench didn't make him gag. It was as though he'd gone beyond physical sensation, that in slaying the boy he'd cut out some small but crucial piece of himself. The daikini lay beneath a hound that was almost as tall as he and more powerfully built. Thorn had no idea if the man was still alive, nor any desire to use insight to find out. It took 2 tries and a major grunt of effort to push the corpse aside. Thorn wrinkled his nose at the sight and smell beneath, and started to breathe a prayer for the daikini, until a closer examination revealed that the mess was mostly of the hound's making. It hadn't been the daikini who killed it either, the creature before the small but lethal mark of brownie blades. "Lucky for you," Thorn muttered, hooking his arms around the beast's massive shoulders and attempting to move it, offering as foul a set of comments as he could give thought at the difference between the respective sizes. He could remember easier times clearing rocks from his field and tree trunks. The ground gave way beneath him, and he slipped forward to put his face in the muck. "Too much effort," he heard in casually disdained tones. "Too little reward." He exhaled a hard puff, and Rule yelped in protest as the brownie suddenly found himself blown onto his own backside. "Thorn!" Mind speech from one of the eagles, sorrow mingling with reproach. For an awful moment he thought one of them had been hurt. It was the mare. She lay on her side, and he marveled that she still had strength to breathe, that there was blood enough within her for her noble heart to still pump. She'd given a magnificent account of herself. That was plain from the bodies scattered around her. Her hooves had broken legs and backs and heads, and the crimson stains across her muzzle were from the bites she inflicted. But she'd been alone in the end, and that had proved the difference. She responded to his presence as he knelt beside her. Nostrils flared as she tried a nicker of greeting that faded into a gargling cough. He stroked her neck, offering all the warmth within him, poised to wipe away her pain, then snipped the last frayed cords that bound her to the world. He couldn't. It enraged him to feel her misery. She hungered for life as much as any he'd known. She'd earned it and more, and all he had to give in return was quick, convenient oblivion. A kindness, folk call this, he said, more to himself, a mercy. And he could hear the acid in his voice, heard as well the laughter of the spirit hound within young Farron's soul. I've lost enough friends, damn you! If there's a chance, the smallest hope, never again! He cast loose his own spirit, and with ghostly senses, his insight, reached deep into the mare. For those first moments he almost wished he hadn't. Bad as she looked from without, the damage within was significantly worse. This will hurt, I'm afraid, he told himself as much as her. Nothing much for that. Too much to do, too little time, too little strength. Haven't the energy to spare to keep the pain of healing at bay. We just have to endure together. They merged, and in that moment he understood the transcendent physical glory of running. That was the heart of her being, the center of life and joy. To race, to eat the endless miles with flashing hooves, to feel the breeze of her own making stretch out her mane like a banner. The old tales said those with eyes ahead were hunters, those with eyes aside, prey. The mare didn't consider herself either. From first breath to last, existence was speed. Thorn made a noise, then put the howls of the death dogs to shame, guttural and harsh, baring teeth as ice fire flayed him from the heart out. Life pounding in his breast like a hammer, harder and faster with each breath, demanding even more of him to sustain the wounded mare as he was trying to save. He took that energy and sent it surging from her own heart, refusing to hear the protests of muscles already pushed past endurance, his own as much as hers, ignoring the spiked bands gathered snug around his chest as about hers. This was as much a battle as the other, with the death dogs and with Farron, and one he was as determined to win. She uttered a cry he'd never heard from any horse, couldn't help a twitch specter of a grin as he recognized it as her version of the bellow he'd just made. Her feet spasmed, eyes rolling, his own body making a feeble attempt to match hers. There was poison in her system. He cleansed it. There were bones chipped and broken. He smoothed them back into place. There were slashes deep and shallow across her body. He stitched them closed. All the while he kept her blood burning through her veins until her skin felt hot to the touch and she seemed to glow in the shadow light of the waning moon. No fever so much as fire, a cleansing blaze that made flesh malleable as a forged flame made metal. At the same time he grew ever more cold. His skin paled, lips and fingertips turned slightly blue as though he'd been sketched with ice. His heart thundered, each beat like a blow, yet there was no sense of movement within his chest, not a hint of blood at any pulse point. Life remained with him solely as an act of will. All else was devoted to his patient. It was the most delicate of tightropes to dance across. The slightest misstep would doom them both. Yet he didn't hesitate and didn't falter. He actually grinned with an excitement and exultation he hadn't felt in a long while. Light flashed across his vision as he blinked desperately to keep from being blinded. Before him, the sun popped over the distant horizon into a sky unmarred by even a hint of cloud. The air was still bitter chill and would be for some while. He wanted to move, but found he couldn't. There was a terrible ache across his chest and for a brief moment he feared his heart had burst. Not quite. It was merely upset at the effort demanded of it, as was every other muscle in his body. He thought himself exhausted after the battle with the mountains, and later with the death dogs. They were nothing compared with this. Stone was more lively. He let his head loll forward. The mare's head lay in his lap, her eyes closed. He knew she wasn't dead. She still radiated his cleansing warmth, and he drew on that gratefully to restore some sensation to his frozen hands. The awareness that the balance between them was shifting woke the animal. She gazed sleepily at him, warm and content, safe in ways he knew she hadn't felt since she was a foal. He did nothing to disturb that feeling. For once she regained her feet and her proper self. She never feel it again, the price demanded for her natural speed and grace. Truth to tell, he didn't mind basking in its glow himself. At last, however, this good thing came to its end. The mare whickered, bending her legs gingerly at first, as though to reassure herself they were still attached and functional. That done, she tucked them under herself, rolling, twisting from side to belly and from there to her feet. She was a little wobbly, one hoof landing perilously close to Thorn, followed by an immediate projection of shame and apology. "Windfleet," Thorn said, as though knowing her name was as natural as knowing his own. She leaned her great head down and puffed warmly into his face. She bent lower, forelegs splaying awkwardly until she was hunkered down enough for him to latch an arm over her neck. Then she gently lifted and supported him until he could thrust his own limbs to hold himself in place. He ran a practiced eye across her flanks. She wasn't pretty any more. The wounds had been too deep and too many, and he hadn't the strength to tidy after himself when his work was done. She didn't mind. These were the sigils of a battle won and a friendship forged. She'd wear them with pride for as long as she drew breath. "Tough lady," he muttered, and staggered back a step or three as she shook out her mane. Her own legs were stiff as posts. They seemed to have forgotten how to bend at the knee, and he went through an entire choreography of gyrations to keep from falling, much to the mare's amusement. She was bigger this morning than he'd remembered. His head barely surpassed her knees, and she carried herself with the eager confidence of one who couldn't wait to discover what this new day would bring. He sensed a change in the mood as he turned from her to the daikini, pausing along the way to wearily pick up a stray bit of tack, her bridle. Windfleet wasn't happy to see it, and as he turned the construction of leather and steel in his hand, he felt his mouth twist in sympathetic memory, a resonance of the bond he and the mare had shared. She had accepted the bit as she had her rider, because she had little choice. She had sensed what happened to those who fought and had no desire to have her spirit broken as well. She liked the man after a fashion. He was a decent enough sort with gentle hands and a calm, unflappable manner. From the beginning, though, she sensed an underlying dissatisfaction. The daikini always seemed to be on the prowl for something better. Whatever he had, whatever he wasn't enough. He wanted more. Now, so did she. Thorn flicked the bridle aside, then turned to the mare with a shrug of the shoulders and a question lift of his hands, as if to say, "What, you're still here?" She cocked her head a little to the side, with so human an expression of perplexity on her features that he had to laugh out loud. He repeated the gesture with more exaggeration, making a game of it. She drew herself to her full height, and he let his smile fade, matching his assumption of formality with one of his own. He offered a bow, which she returned. With a cry of pure delight, she wheeled up her hind legs and sped from the campsite, picking her way unerringly along a path only she could see, until she reached the open plains, and he learned that her name had been well chosen. He didn't watch too long, although one of the eagles kept an eye on her from on high, until she crossed the visible horizon and safely made the grasslands where the wild ponies ran. She'd have a good life there. His stomach was growling something fierce, but he thrust the awareness from his mind. There was no place for a meal. "Brilliant move! A veritable masterstroke!" He ignored the words and the brownie and concentrated instead on gathering his belongings and those of the daikini. "I swear it's a stratagem I certainly never have thought of." Thorn rounded on Frangine, who stood his ground with a monumental lack of concern, leaning against a stone, legs crossed, idly examining his fingernails as though he stood at court and not in the wildlands battlefield. "You have something to say," Thorn challenged. "Heaven forbid!" Thorn turned back to the task at hand. Frangine didn't let him take another step. "Why should I criticize the slightest the casting loose of soul mode of transport? Forgotten how to walk, have you? We're none of us giants, Drumheller, in words designed for the likes of them." Thorn didn't need to see the gesture or the expression that went with it to know the brownie meant the daikini. "We need all the help we can get. I, for one, would prefer putting as much distance as possible between us and this place." "No argument." "You could have asked, for Precious's sake." "She needed to be free, Frangine. The daikini wouldn't have allowed that. Or would you have our next scrap be with him?" The daikini coughed. "We've managed this far on our own," Thorn finished patiently. "You'd think some of us would have learned sense along the way." The Daikini yawned, big mouth, lots of teeth, mostly straight. He'd made noises, blinking himself blearily awake, taking no notice of Thorn hunkering down just out of arm's reach. He scratched himself and shivered with genuine cold. The sun was higher, but the ground hadn't noticed. He tried to speak, only to come out with worse sounds than before, all colored by the rasping cloak of a dry throat. Thorn had a water bottle at hand. He tossed it over, and the much bigger man took a monstrous swallow, followed by a heartfelt sigh. "Mother blessed, I needed that." He flopped onto his belly, but didn't try for more, rubbing his hands over face and skull as though to reassure himself that all the pieces remained. He cast a glance at the creature stretched beside and behind him. "Damn, that's one huge puppy. Thought I was done for sure when it came at me. Figured I was slashing air for all the harm I did." "It's their breeding. They're a warped branch of the line of warhounds the Vale folk raised, more resistant than most of the touch of cold iron to defend their holdings against you, Daikini. You work steel, same as we Nelwyns and the Forge folk. The Vale folk can't bear the touch of it. The thought of it only fair to come... They thought it only fair to come at you with creatures who were substantially immune to it." The Daikini levered himself up to sitting position. "The Vale folk have truck with such as this?" Thorn shook his head. "This is a bastard breed, as I said. Tainted. I thought we'd seen the last of them." "Oh? Who were ye, then? Got a name, have you?" "Thorn," was the reply. "Thorn Drumheller." Chapter 2. The Daikini name was Garin Havilhand, rank of trooper, serving with the Royal Angwin Pathfinders attached to the Outland garrison at Bandicor. He wasn't happy about the horse. His mood wasn't improved by Thorn's insistence that they be gone before sunset, nor that he had any objection, not that he had any objection to leaving, he just didn't want to walk. To Thorn's surprise, Garin's gear proved to be a lot less trouble than it looked. With surprising ease, the saddle was modified to a fairly serviceable backpack. The equipment attached itself to the man as freely as to his mount. "What?" the Daikini grumbled when he caught Thorn watching. "You think this isn't the first animal ever got lost or killed? Tack's expensive. And it weren't no small job in it, neither. Nor," he finished pointedly, "my horse." Thorn said nothing. He had his own tasks to perform. He hooked his hands under the armpits of the last of the hounds and backpedaled toward the scar. He hadn't asked for help, and once Garin had seen what he was doing, the Daikini hadn't offered. The effort of disposing the slain had consumed pretty much all the remaining strength. Every few steps he had to stop for breath, and each time it was harder and harder for him to get going again. Clothes and beard and hair were stiff with caked blood and mud and filth, and although his nose had long since grown numb and senseless, he knew he stank abominably. He had the feeling he could wash himself from now until the sun grew cold and never again believed himself wholly clean. At the edge of the crater, standing where his hands had left imprints in the fused rock when he'd pulled himself back up over the top after the fight, he hugged the body upright as he could. A challenge at the best of times, virtually impossible now the rigor had begun to freeze the corpse's joints. He managed nonetheless, aware that the sun was higher in the sky, and he still had much to do. There was no special words to speak. He simply gave the creature a shove and toppled him into the pit. The body bounced once before it flamed. It never touched earth a second time. Only one left. "Let it lie, Thorn," said a small voice, uncharacteristically still, with a rare use of the name Sorsha had given him. "Let the wind take it," echoed Rule. "No, decent wind will," he gasped in reply, needing a full breath for every word as he readied himself for what was to come. "It'll taint whatever it touches," he finished. "Then let it go!" Frangine cried with a passion Thorn had never heard from him before. "You didn't kill him," Rule said, more matter-of-factly. "Isn't your task." "Wrong." The body hadn't stirred from where it fell, a sad little shape as bereft of innocence as life. "I know you mean well, Rule," he started to say as he approached the boy. "Was the sorcerer who made him do the killing, Drumheller," the brownie said, as though stating a fact of nature. "There's no blame on you for what you've done here." "Doesn't matter. It's my job because the shadow arts are involved, and may well be the only one left with any hope of bringing the fiend responsible to justice. And my debt, because mine were the first hands to touch him, and the first face he saw. I breathed life into him, Rule. There's but one reason to take this particular boy and twist him to so foul a shaping, because he's linked with me. He took the boy in his arms, ignoring the protests of the muscles and joints he had, the squabbles of the brownies, and made his way to the edge of the crater. I should have found you sooner, Farron, he said, voice thickening with every word. Just because he could no longer bring himself to cry didn't mean he'd lost the capacity to grieve. If anything, it made the emotion of all the more keenly felt. When there was still a chance to free a portion of your soul. For that, I am truly sorry. He couldn't let go. The boy had to be dropped as the dogs were, so that not even ashes would be left to further befoul this already blighted landscape, but his arms and hands wouldn't do as they were told. Quite the opposite, in fact. The more he demanded release, the tighter they gathered the body close. Suddenly the air about him blazed hot as a furnace. There was an incendiary breeze across his face, like the gusts that came across his working coals with each plunge of the bellows, and the smell of clean burning in his nostrils. A flash of insight gave him a view from the brownie's perspective as he was wrapped snug in streamers of raw flame that seemed to erupt from the solid earth at his feet. They swirled around his legs, up his back, over his shoulders, down his arms, stretched themselves out full length along the body that he held until it was as encased as he. Then, with the faintest pop of imploding air, both fire and burden were gone, the one reducing the other in a moment to less than ashes, as though it had never been. Thorn was untouched, at least in body. He sank to his knees and laid his palms across the imprints he'd made, impulling his defenses as both invitation and gesture of friendship. He sensed no tangible reply. The mountain spirits were keeping a healthy distance. He made a helpless little fiddle with his hands, not really an apology, for there was nothing he could say that could take away the hurt inflicted here, and he'd already refused to do what was wanted of him. At last, he said simply, "Thank you." He forced himself to look one last time at the scar, using all his perceptions, human and wizardly. Outsight showed him a vast, smooth depression, so dark and fathomless, even beneath broadest daylight, it might have been the fabled black water of childhood stories. He remembered his father telling him the tales, and his mother, scandalized that her beloved would frighten a child so, gathering Thorn into her arms. The thing was, though he'd squealed and cried and buried himself beneath his comforter, he hadn't been scared. Not really. No more than his own children had been when he'd become the storyteller. He broke away from those thoughts, an effort that left him shaking like a rider who'd just reined in a runaway mount, and cast himself wholly into the grasp of his talent. Insight showed him a scar that wasn't dark at all, at least not around the edges. It was like looking at the evening sky in the moments before night claims in full dominion. The dominant hue around the periphery was a rich purple, shot through with bands of a brighter shade, mostly reds, winding traceries that looked random at first glance, with an unsettling resemblance to the patterns of blood vessels he could see burrowing through his own flesh. They faded in number and intensity as his eyes moved toward the center of the depression until they were no more. The forces unleashed here had scoured the topsoil clean and reached down into the bedrock, purging the land not only of the corruption that had tried to claim it, but of all capacity for life as well. Nothing in his experience, nothing in his imagination had ever presented him with so barren a wasteland. And he thought, what price, victory, if it costs everything you're trying to save? He was beyond tired. He knew that. By rights, there was nothing he could do, even if he was of a mind to try. He fumbled in his pouch, one of two he carried on his belt, provisions for his wanderings and the tools of his trade, came up with a handful of seeds and one plump acorn. Interesting, he thought with a sniff of surprise. High meadows aspens make sense, as do the rowan. This oak, though. He began to walk a rough line along the crater, pausing along the way, in the same seemingly arbitrary manner he'd used to pick up stones within the scar, to hunker down and stab his thumb into the earth. Into each hole went a seed. The oak was the centerpiece, the anchor for the entire copse. For that, he returned to the clearing. We be gone? Garen asked companionably. Thorn chose to ignore the dour undertone of the man's voice. It had been a hard night for them all, no reason to expect best behavior. I've one thing left to do, he replied. The Daikini wasn't much interested. With a grunt of effort, he hefted his saddle back and moved off through the scrub. For all his talk, the sight of the battle made him twitchy. It wouldn't break his heart in the slightest to see the last of it. That feeling suited Thorn. For what he intended, he preferred to be alone. This hole he dug with both hands, muttered darkly as a nail torn badly enough to draw blood, then smiling, a thin, hardly noticeable tightening of his lips, in wry self-mockery at how the fates sometimes conspire to give us what we require, only not quite the way we intended, or desire. He rubbed a few drops of blood into the loamy earth, added some water from the bottle he'd pulled from his other pouch, feeling the texture of the dirt change around his fingers as he worked the soil. This hadn't been the best land to begin with. No farmer in his right mind would settle in the lee of the mountain range. Too many different kinds of weather, and almost all of it violent as a pitched battle. Few species survived here, and even fewer prospered. There was no guarantee what he was planting would do either. But there was the possibility. There was the hope. He cast his spirit self into the soil and felt all his good intentions shrivel. The brush and shrubbery of the clearing had been deceptive, as had the sparse patches of grass scattered along the slope. The elemental force that had scoured the scar had reached beyond the crater, chasing down with a ruthless ferocity every vestige of the power that had destroyed the mountain. It reminded him of one of the first healings he attempted. Less than a dozen years gone, now that he took a moment to count the days, yet it seemed to him like ancient history. A young man, one of the freebooting Kiskani, viciously savaged by a pack of death dogs. The wounds had turned septic from the start, generating a gangrenous rot that was eating him alive from within. Thorn was flush with his own gifts then, strong beyond his dreams but sorely lacking in control. The healing got away from him. He found, to his horror, that he couldn't call back the energies he had unleashed. He was purged not only of the infection, but healthy tissue as well. It had been a hard struggle that very nearly consumed Thorn, but the man lived. Much the same had happened here. The mountains had thought only of expunging the poison that would have ultimately killed them, not of the consequences. They'd been attacked. That attack must be repelled. To save themselves, they as much as destroyed the land around them. The acorn wouldn't hatch, a sprout take root, but it would be a weak, pathetic excuse for an oak. No matter how deep or widespread the root network grew, the ground wouldn't have strength enough to anchor it. A few decent winds would yank the tree loose and hurl it away, same with all the others he'd planted. He'd had these suspicions from the start that the damage was so great, but he denied them to himself, afraid of what would be required to overcome it. Yet he couldn't walk away any more than he could from the Daikini's horse, any more than he could from his responsibilities. He willed a little more blood from his cut finger, felt anticipatory tingling along the nerves that heralded each manifestation of his talent. He desperately wanted to sleep. He ached in every limb and bone. He cast the feelings aside. He started to sing a winter song about the world still and quiescent, where all the elements of being tidied themselves from the previous season and gathered their energies for the one to come. He reminded the earth of the falling snow, though in his telling the storms were gentle and restorative, no mention of killing blizzards or freezing cold that turned the ground hard as stone. With each refrain, each new verse, he moved the days forward, the sun staying longer overhead, its warmth gradually reaching deeper into the ground, first melting the snow, its fresh, clean water saturating the earth. At the same time, he cast the mixture of water and blood that he was continually and thoroughly needing out from the hole he dug, burrowing channels of energy in every direction, as though he were the tree and this the formidable tangle of roots that sustained him. Only in this instance he drew no sustenance from the soil, but undertook the reverse, as he had with it the mare, sending the essence of his own life cascading down these many pathways. His voice deepened and darkened with passion, building naturally toward a crescendo, reminding the land of spring, when it woke from winter hibernation to find life in all its myriad variations, bursting forth in glorious chaos. Life, death, Rebirth, the age-old cycle. How it had always been and should ever be. He was sodden top to toe, as though some cruel spirit had laid a magnifying glass atop his head to gather every wayward scrap of sunlight and focus it on him. Molten within, melting without, a race to see which would consume him first. Far, far worse than what he'd endured to heal Windfleet. No comparison between the two healings. He'd known that from the start. The mare at least had been alive. She fought for the life with the same determination she showed against the death dogs. He clenched his fists so tight he'd crushed coal to diamonds, then released them with a rush. He'd spread his fingers as wide as they'd go, a greater spread than most daikini hands could achieve, laying his palms into the sodden earth as gently as he'd bathed his fresh-born children. No restraint now to his casting, not a single conscious thought, trusting to blind instinct in this final effort to guide him. He felt the raw energy course along the pathways of his nerves. Couldn't help but smile as he heard squawks of alarm from the brownies as though some traceries made themselves visible under his skin. There was a style of dance in the spice lands on the far side of this continent, at both village festivals and the court, where the dancers attached lengths of brightly colored ribbons to wrists and ankles. The challenge was, so long as the music played, to never let one of those streamers touch the ground or come even slightly to rest. Not so hard for the wrist-bound ribbons, something altogether different from the ties at each ankle. The dancers would prance and spin and whirl, the ribbons would stream behind them like pennants or wrap themselves around the outstretched limbs until it seemed that the figures were no longer flesh at all, but composed instead of wild, flashing bands of color. Although Thorn was still at stone, he thought he looked much the same, casting a radiance bright enough to show even against the sunlight, and then he wondered if that would bring the daikini back for a look. He had neither strength nor thought to spare to cast a shield wall to keep the man away, and then wondered why it was so important to hide the full extent of his talent. Another flash of instinct. Trust one, trust them all. He cradled the acorn in his hand, energies coruscating about the tiny seed, awakening its own infant passion, but most of all, imbuing it with a portion of Thorn's own essence, a dash of wonder, a bit of joy, a pinch of determination. Some of what he hoped was the best of himself he passed on to the tree, and by extension to this plot of land. He blinked fiercely, eyes suddenly flooded nearly to overflowing as giant blotches of fatigue swam lazily across the field of his vision, and realized that he was done. He looked down to the ground where he'd been working by canting his head, letting it loll forward at an awkward angle so he could properly see. The hole he dug was completely filled in, hardly a sign to differentiate it from any other part of the clearing. He bent all the way over to touch his forehead to the ground and took a deep breath. He couldn't help but smile. There was a change. There'd been no smell to the land, a dry, dusty neuter before, worse than the harshest desert. Now it reminded him of home. His plantings had their chance. "Whatever the hell you doing, Peck?" demanded a voice from on high in an avalanche of gruff confusion. Diminutive term for a diminutive people, favored by those lacking sufficient wit to see beyond the obvious. He hated it. He spared a look up the leg of the talking daikini mountain. "Resting," prompted Frangine from hiding with a hiss. "Resting?" Thorn repeated. "Thought ye were one wanted to be gone so quick." "Just tidying up," he offered with a groan. It was easier to sit than he expected. That was the ongoing irony of his talent. One of the aspects that never failed to surprise him. The more powerful the healing, the more it took out of him. Yet, at the same time, he invariably found himself restored almost as much as his patient. What was offered was returned, good for good, the balance maintained. He hadn't cast out so much of himself, freely and without restraint, in ages, nor felt so fulfilled as the result. He scratched himself, painfully aware once more of how unutterably filthy he was. Heavens, no, he thought, what I must look like. Then noticed the daikini gazing about the campsite. "'S different," Garen noted. "Oh?" The daikini shrugged. "'S nothing." Thorn clambered upright. "Lovely day," he said, which it was. beats what could have been, and that's a fact, was Garrett's solid response. Clearly a man who'd related to the world straight on. Had food and water a week's worth, maybe husband's proper. Had? The man sighed. Damn dogs. Food was trail rations, salted proper, packed proper. Thorn knew what he meant. Standard issue for travelers. Food so awful that to taste that even the eagles wouldn't touch it. All rotted overnight, Garen continued glumly. Water bags torn to shreds. None of that left, neither. Farron's doing. Nothing was safe from the innate corruption of the master of a great hunt, so stories told. Given time enough, in the right quarry, it was said that such a creature could putrefy stone to bring down a fortress wall. Thorn gathered up his own knapsack and followed the daikini out to the outer edges of the brush, where it faded into scrub grass and boulders. There, Garen paused, his hands resting on his belt, as ostensibly casual pose, belied by a thread of tension running through the muscles of legs and backs and shoulders. His scabbards for swords and big knife hung low, angled for a quick combat draw, and the daikini stood with a respectful separation between himself and Thorn. Saw you changed, Peck, for the attack, Garen said. So you some sort of shaper, maybe? Just a wanderer, he replied. Saw what I saw, and that's a fact. A seeming was all. Then ye are a witchy boy. Hardly, which was far as he dared stretch the truth, since he didn't consider himself a witch, and hadn't been a boy in longer than he cared to remember. What you do with them bodies, eh? Toss them into the hole, the scar back that way, where the mountain used to be. The daikini nodded sagely. Heard tale of it. Down the flat. Didn't hold much truck with the stories, though. I mean mountains, they don't just blow to bits. Thorn made half a turn, raised a hand to present the scene beyond, as if inviting the daikini to take himself a look. Yeah, well, Garen floundered, body language making plain that he had no intention of doing so. It's a place of power, Thorn told him. Things happen here. Things are seen here that aren't like anywhere else. The Nelwyn held out his hand. Believe what else you will, Trooper Haviland. I tell you true, I am no demon, nor, I pray, anything evil. The young man fiddled on his feet from one to the other, as if the boots pinched, held out his own hand, still gloved, although Thorn's was bare, took the little man's in the briefest of gasps, as though afraid the contact would leave him cursed. Whatever. Stood by me, he concluded. Did your fair share of the killing ground. Only right to grant you that. Scales between us, they're most likely balanced. If you've a different path to walk, my friend, Thorn told him as they started on their way, I'll not be offended. Garen looked back over his shoulder in surprise and spread his mouth in a shamefaced grin. He automatically set the trooper's pace in a matter of steps and left an Elwyn behind. In wild lands like this, he said as Thorn caught up, better I'm thinking folks walk together. The better we keep eyes on one another, said Frangine in Thorn's ear from a perch atop the Nelwyn's shoulder, snugged among the folds of his cloak where the brownie would be hard to see. Sides, Garen said with evident pride, I'm a pathfinder. I'll find us the easiest way. Except that we know the way, thank you very much. Frangine, Thorn hissed, be silent. Say something, did you? Asked Garen. Pardon? Thought I heard me, I'm afraid. Talking to myself. Daft, I know, but it's a habit I've got into roaming on my own, sort of providing my own companionship. Whatever, Garen shrugged, as though this was but one more strangeness to be encountered on the road, to be recounted with suitable embellishments in barracks to his messmates over evening ale. I'll take the point. Shall I? See what's about? First a daikini along a trail few of his kind have ridden, said Frangine. Then a great hunt of death dogs. Interesting coincidence, don't you think? I'd rather not think at all, thank you very much. Not to worry, you have Rule in me to do that for you in the main. I'm simply keeping you informed. Rule was in the pack itself. He preferred it to Thorn's belt pouches. The pack had solid, tangible dimensions. They'd both taken refuge in his pouch the night before. Tirsleen's destruction, doing what Thorn knew now was no dream, Rule came out describing it as a warehouse of infinite space, with limit to any perception. He was small enough as it was. He had no desire to spend time in a place that made him feel less than nothing. Frangine, by contrast, had claimed it for his own. It was where, Thorn suspected, he stored his own worldly goods. How kind of you! Don't take that tone with me, Sira. You'd be lost without the proper minders. I don't think so, was the only thought that flashed in his brain, perfectly matched the way they so often spoke to him. Fatigue, fortunately, kept it from going any further. Don't be snippy, Thorn, a knell now from overhead, as he felt a flash of heat at how open his mind occasionally remained to his companions. If the eagles sensed that thought as well and took offense, she made no sign. Listen to what he says. We had our back to the scar, Frangine continued, without the slightest hint of banter in his tone, and Thorn realized the brownie was deadly serious. That tipped the balance. Anywhere else, we'd have taken our share with us, but we had died. He wanted to argue the point, but had a grim suspicion the brownie was right. But why, Frangine? We've been traveling near a dozen years. What's changed to provoke this adversary to make an active effort to find me? If you think I'm going to do all the work, from Frangine's tone, Thorn knew the answer had to be plainly visible. No game either. That was Garin, adding to his earlier observations, thinking aloud for Thorn's benefit. Haven't seen any, large or small, since I came to these parts. No water along my back trail, leastways, not that we can reach in time. They've been all fouled as well. Do you know this country? The Nelwyn asked. Shake of the head. No reason to. No settlements up this way. Not even wanderer bands. Nothing to fear. Nothing much that I ever heard of to interest a body. Rule always was, leave well enough alone. He looked around. Suppose this king's land probably claimed it so in Angwin, but only 'cause it's here. Ain't even been proper mapped. Then what brought you? A fool's errand. I was starting to think. Was told there was a healer roaming the high country. Been trouble on the river. Those dogs and worse. Needed help bad. That's what was said. I'm good on a trail. Figured I'd bring him in. No fool you, Garin, at least in that regard. You're the healer, then? Among other things. Had a fair chance mounted. Afoot, had a bear as this country is. Dunno how long it'll take to reach the settlement. 3 days that direction. Thorn pointed across the plain, a little to the left of the sunrise. Will bring us to a river, an uplands tributary of the Serenay. Not much use, unless you have a boat handy. Thorn allowed himself a smile. You never know, he said. Malrune was as sour-faced as ever, as though he'd been kept waiting just this side of eternity. Not so tall as Garin, but easily twice as broad. He was built like a barrel, and was just as hard to move when he wasn't of mind. His hair was a thicket of midnight curls, making up on his chest and back and limbs for the increased lack of it atop his head. He favored a beard cut close along the line of his jaw to serve as a demarcation for a double chin that no amount of exercise could remove. For the first time, Thorn saw sprinklings of salt among the pepper, and age made its presence felt. In terms of features, there was no comparison between Malrune and Garin. The Pathfinder had him beaten without question, and while Garin had the looks, there was a charm and character that the Kaskani captain had made him just as memorable to the ladies. They'd give Garin the first glance, but always return to Malrune. Happier thoughts, Thorn knew, of happier days. None of that was in evidence now. Malrune had anchored his keelboat in midstream, as long before reaching the river. Thorn saw the telltale flash of the telescope being leveled in their direction. There'd be bows sighted on them as well, until the captain was satisfied of their bona fides. From his perch on the boat's signal yard, Bastian stretched his great wings, and Thorn let his insight bounce to the eagle for a reverse angle on the scene, then up to Enel, flying high cover above for an overview. So the lady found you, did he, Drumheller? The lad, Malrune called deliberately making his island accent so broad it was nearly incomprehensible. Good thing for the both of us that he did, Thorn replied. The great hunt came for us that very night. Malrune used a speaking trumpet to make himself heard across the water and bank. Thorn's reply was in normal voice, yet the captain heard him plain. And then, Master Drumheller? It won't be coming for anyone else. Their trek had been kind to Garin, even though it had mostly been downhill and the country fairly gentle. Without water to wash, he was caked with sweat, so much so that Thorn tried not to breathe whenever the wind shifted around behind him, although he had to concede he probably smelled as ripe. Pathfinder uniforms tended to be far more practical than those of other regiments of the Royal Cavalry, but no male forged its comfortable but no male forged is comfortable under the open sun, especially in the high country where its rays are more intense than down toward the sea level. The shine had faded from the boots as well, and from the way the man had been walking lately, Thorn suspected blisters. Mulroon and the crewmen at the oars stayed seated as the jolly boat touched shore, again to provide a clear field of fire from the archers afloat. "You made quick passage up from Saganac," Thorn commented as he settled himself beside the captain, another moment when a Nelwyn's size worked to his advantage. He was the only one who could share a thwart with the big man. "You sent your eagles south for note? We were already here." The oarsman pulled hard to clear the boat from the shore, shoulders hunched low, eyes sweeping the bank behind. Thorn saw ripples just behind the water's surface, a few body lengths out, pacing the boat and slicing it as it was straight across the current. "Since when did the worm act as combat flankers?" he asked. "Seems prudent in these circumstances. There's more to this damnable dogs." "I know," Thorn hissed, and softly hammered fist on knee. "Aye," Mulroon nodded. "Baddest kind of business, this. Tore through Saganac 3 weeks back, just before the dark of the moon. Left dead and worse behind." "Is there anything?" "What was needful has already been done, Thorn, but I thank you for the offer. I sent the troopers after you mainly as precaution. Glad to see that at least turned out well." "You were hurt in the fight?" There were fresh bandages across the bare forearm and a couple of healing slashes hidden in his tunic. No sense of corruption, though. Only the faint buzz he felt when nature was doing its proper work. "Not so bad as many. My wife's brother, I hadn't put the laddie down. He was the one introduced you to me." "I remember." "Aye, that went for the giftist first, you see." That was the way the death dogs. Start the attack by eliminating anyone capable of curing their infections or doing them significant harm. "I'm sorry." "He were a good man. He'll be missed. But that weren't the worst of it." "I know. Farron. In all the chaos, was a while afore anyone realized he was missing. We were all set to start a posse, with the worm pulled us out. Never seen him so upset. Wouldn't take no back sass. Tried to take the trooper as well, but being too damn dumb to know better, he figured he could do the job enough on his lonesome. Bless my soul, he was good as his word." "I'm a Pathfinder," was all Garin felt needed saying in response, but there was evident pride in his face as well. Mulroon didn't offer such compliments easily, and Garin understood that. "I didn't want to ask, Thorn," Mulroon continued, "but the wife, she'll—" "There was nothing left, old friend. He'd been wrapped tight in the change spell, one of the lesser banes, to make him leader of a great hunt." "Damn." The man's lips barely moved. The word was spoken so faintly, none but Thorn had the slightest inkling Mulroon had spoken. Yet Thorn knew it was as though an acid lash had laid him open to the core. "It's a while," Mulroon said after a time, "since this sort of misery's been aboard." The Cascani were rovers, by land when necessary, but preferred by water. They hailed from a group of rugged islands off the continent's western coast, and ages ago had formed an alliance with the Wyrn, who claimed the ocean's rocky coast as their home. Together, the two races roamed the whole of the globe and helped bind it together with trade. The structure of both societies was familiar, and it was altogether normal for Weir children to be fostered to Cascani households and vice versa, with appropriate spells being cast to enable air breathing, Daikini to survive the underwater. The Wyrn needed no such aid, since they proved to be at home in either realm. Each great clan among the Cascani controlled a fleet of merchant vessels, and through them a network of trading posts. There were few restrictions against intermarriage between the clans, which meant over time that virtually every Cascani was in some way related to every other Cascani, and was therefore welcome in their house, be it next door or around the far side of the world. They drove hard bargains, but they also prized honor above almost all else. To break faith with a client or a customer, or with those rare few accepted by the clan as a friend, was to bring shame not simply to the person responsible, but to the clan as a whole. In a world thick with its share of pirates and thieves, they had established themselves as the benchmark of trust and fair dealing. Though all of Thorn's life, Bavmorda's growing power had kept them clear of Tirasleen and the adjacent kingdoms. With her gone, and a full measure of political stability restored, Malrun's brother-in-law had seen an opportunity for expansion. Unfortunately, en route to Tirasleen, he'd run afoul of a random clutch of death dogs. Mad Mardigan and Sorcia slew the beasts. Thorn used his healing talents to save the man, and through him had met Malrun. They'd been friends ever since. "Now I think about it clear," Malrun continued, moving the tiller to bring the boat alongside the larger craft. "Seems it was Farron's house they were for right off." "Just dogs, Jasso?" And when Malrun answered with a nod, "How many?" "No proper recollection, none left to find, so far as bodies go," a humorless twist of his face. "We'd given better accounts of ourselves than scrap, that's certies." "It was me they were after," Thorn said quietly as Malrun grasped a line tossed down from the deck above to hold them fast to the keelboat's hull. "That's why they took Farron." "Razzie!" Malrun bellowed at his mate, half the boat length forward. "Up anchor! Let's be gone while we've daylight!" Then he leaned over the side and sang a series of noises that best resembled dolphin bubbles crossed with seal barks. A sleek and shiny face immediately broke surface. "Two of you on point at all times, Dequise. Find me a clear channel and let me know. You sense the slightest shadow." "As you request, sister elder's cousin's consort." The weir's sleek mahogany fur was plastered to his skull with the luster of fresh lacquer, which in turn made his dark eyes appear that much larger. They were dakini-sized, as comfortable on land as in the sea, where they had made their home. Of all the races in the world, they seemed the least ambitious, possessed instead of a generous and genuine curiosity about their fellow sentient creatures. Their preference was to make friends with whomever they encountered. If that didn't work, they moved on. Many made the mistake of assuming the trait to be a mark of cowardice, a misconception that lasted only until they encountered one in a fight. Unfortunately, on such occasions, only the weir generally lived to tell the tale, and on this subject they did no talking. Malrun paused a moment, in the act of clambering over the keelboat's gunwale to reach his back to help Thorn aboard. "Why?" he demanded. "Same question I've been asking myself these past days," Thorn replied. "Brownies are being obstinate. They won't tell." "Feed 'em the fishes, then. What the hell good are they?" Thorn ignored the squawks of protest and outrage from the various parts of his person, as well as the threats of what would happen should anyone try such foolishness, but he had to smile. It was the first humorous impulse he had felt since the scar. "I hate this, actually knowing that I know the answer, that it's probably right in front of me, plain as daylight, only I can't see the blessed bloody thing." "Patience, then," Malrun grunted, watching Razzie supervise the anchor details as they hauled the hook pulled free from the bottom, feeling the current take hold of his boat. "Worry yourself too much. It'll never come." Thorn shrugged, clambering up to his favorite perch atop the main cabin with his back to the signal mast, where he could enjoy the warmth of the sun and not being in the way. There was a dull ache on his hips that he knew would be a fair while passing, too chronic and ingrained for casual healing to banish, and he didn't have the will enough to do more. He simply wasn't designed for such walking. "I brought Farron into the world," he mused aloud. "Beg pardon?" Malrun queried, though his captain's attention was mostly on the boat as he motioned his steersman behind him to keep their course in mid-channel. "The dogs." "Aye." "Though Farron, the great hunt, could follow and find me." "If you say so, Drumheller. But who knows a thing like that?" "Who indeed? Someone, I suppose, who knows the facts and faces of my life as well as I do myself." "And maybe," he heard Rule say from a snug in his pocket, "with power enough to smash a sacred citadel." "I heard that," Malrun said. "I wish I hadn't." "Been hunting y'all all this while, then? Since Tirasleen?" Thorn shook his head. "I don't think so. For one, I think they'd have caught up to us before now. For another," He broke off a moment to mull over some thoughts. They were too young. So was Farron. Say what? Cast that kind of bane on a boy, you'll kill him. The body simply can't withstand the stress. But Farron had come of age. He'd begun his change of life, his growth into manhood, just enough to make the difference. That was a mistake. He'd have been a little older, a little bigger, a little stronger. I'm sure I would have beaten him. So why didn't they wait? It's been a dozen years since the cataclysm. What's one more? For that matter, why come for me at all? I don't even know what I'm up against. Wherein am I a threat? Beg pardon, shipmaster, Garen asked, not quite sure how to approach the big bearded ruffian with the airs and manners of a pirate. There was no mistaking who was in command here, but the informal relationship of captain to crew evidently unnerved him. In his world, there was no place for such casual behavior. Heard you mention Tirasleen. What's that you? A shrug. Heard tell of it is all. Of Tirasleen? Thorn couldn't help the incredulity of his voice. My sergeant back in Bandicourt. He'd been there. Thorn and Mulroon exchanged looks, then fixed their gaze once more on the trooper, who was beginning to wish he'd kept silent. To the far side of the world, Mulroon rumbled. Well now, there's a rover. The Pathfinder made a shamefaced grimace and made a show of playing with his spurs. Weren't him alone went, he told them. Was a triple century, so he said, sent by the king. Whatever for? Asked Thorn. Looking for a whatchamacallit, Nelwyn, he said at last. Thorn kept his tone casual. The Angwin king sent a force of pathfinders to Tirasleen? And some other place where 'twas said the demon queen Bavmorda held sway. Nockmaar. That sounds right. Heard of them places, had you? Thought they were stories mostly myself, that sergeant having me on. What did they find? No fortress, Tirasleen. Funny, wouldn't say more'n that, no matter how hard we're pressed. Seems scared, now as I recall. No Nelwyn either. Found a valley and a village, so he told us, but been years since anyone lived there. It was a good land, for most part, but empty, like a whole country got up one day and left. It pretty much did, Thorn said, mostly to himself, remembering the endless caravans of carts and goats and people on foot, streaming for the borders with as many of their worldly possessions as they could carry. Even the Vale folk had taken flight, or sealed their barrows tight against all intrusion. By the time he'd made his way to Tirasleen, to see the disaster for himself, he and his brownies were the only people walking that ancient land. That sergeant, Garen said. He said the land was cursed. No more than any other. But why the expedition? How should I know? I weren't there. And His Royal Majesty the King, he don't see fit to tell me. Then Garen relented a little and gave them the only answer he knew. But I figured they was looking for Willow. I beg your pardon? Thorn said. The Nelwyn sorcerer. Don't you know? Willow Ufgood? Willow Ufgood, Thorn repeated. Now there's a name I haven't heard in a very long time. You know him? Garen cried, mightily impressed. Damn, wish I knew him. I'd bring him to the king like the proclamation said. A shy grin, and the thought of the young Daikini was amazed at his own presumption to aim so high. My fortune be made. Get a posting to the Red Lions. Those are the king's household guard, culled from the best troops in royal service, and therefore acclaimed to be the finest in all the world. What's he want with this Willow? Thorn asked. Don't you know nothing? Humor me. The Ascension. This is the celebration of the sacred Princess Elora's 13th birthday, a year of life for each of the great domains. He's her godfather and all, isn't he? Willow saved her from the dark forces. He destroyed the demon queen Bavmorda. He has to be there. This last stated as an immutable fact, an article of primal faith, like saying the sun will rise tomorrow. Oh, was what Thorn said. Then, in some amazement of his own, I'd forgotten. The answer, plain as daylight, as impossible actually to see. He could hear the brownies laughing and couldn't fault them for it. He should have known. It's been that long, he mused aloud. I assumed you knew, Mulroon said. I must have lost count of the season. What do you know of Willow? Thorn asked the Pathfinder suddenly sharply. He's a sorcerer, said with a twist of his shoulders as if that was all Garen needed to know. And a Nelwyn too. Yes. But, meaning no disrespect, shipmaster, didn't the shipmaster here call you a Nelwyn? Yes. Can't be right then, I mean. Willow's a great sorcerer, a legend, a hero. He can't be anything like you. Not saying, you understand, you're lacking courage or nothing like that, he continued hurriedly, fearing he'd given offense. Not the way of it all. You were expecting someone taller, Mulroon suggested, almost beside himself with throttled delight. Well, yeah. Garen thought the captain had thrown him a lifeline. Tell him, an outraged Frangine hissed in Thorn's ear. He won't believe. Believe what? The Daikini asked. As far as Nelwyns go, I'm as good as you're likely to find, and Willow was an Elwyn. They must have got that wrong. The king appears to be going to a lot of trouble. That's gospel. Ain't been no celebration like it since the world began, so it's said. Excitement brightened the young man's tone. This was an event he clearly wished to see. Ambassadors coming from all the great domains, even those of the realms beyond. Be a sight to behold, all right. Aye. You're lucky day then, trooper, Mulroon interjected. You're out old Bandicourt garrison, you say? The young man nodded. Way these rivers run, by the time we reach a post where you can requisition a decent you'll have near the whole of the northern provinces to cross before you're home. Be just as easy and a lot quicker to take you all the way down to the bay, transfer you to another packet that'll take you where you need to go. Don't think anyone will hold it against you for staking yourself a couple of days stopover in Angwin proper when you go, since it's right along the way. You can travel with me as far as Maragway. Then I'll pass you on to the captain I trust. His tone made his dismissal plain. As far as he was concerned, the general conversation was ended. With a shallow nod of the head, Garen took the hint, gathered his gear, looked around for somewhere to go. Razi, Mulroon called, see the lad settled and forward. Show him the galley and the head, and the washroom for himself and his outfit. We're a working boat, mind you, trooper, he finished to the young man himself, so I'd appreciate it if you mind where you walk. Stay out of the way unless you need. You had a question, feel free to ask. Elsewise, get along with us. We'll do the same to you. I've no funds to pay for such a passage, shipmaster. Mulroon waved his words aside. You do me a service. You help save a friend. That's the least I can offer in return. Be off, lad. Make yourself comfortable. Garen had to restrain himself from acknowledging Mulroon with a salute, as though in those few words he'd somehow been transported back to the garrison parade ground. Then he hurried after the mate. Bit brusque with the trooper, weren't you? Thorn was wondering a while later in Mulroon's cabin as he toweled himself dry. He was trembling with cold despite his sorcerous projections against the elements, from immersion in the river that was mainly highland snowmelt and therefore not so far removed from freezing. The towel, fortunately, had come from a warming rack in the galley. He wrapped it snug around himself until only part of him left to see was far too hairy face, and basked delightedly in its glow. My nature, don't you know? I was hoping you'd take us the whole way, Jasso. The big man poured himself a mug of steaming tea from a flask on his desk, then handed another across to Thorn. It was almost too hot to drink, and flavored with lemon. Tasted better than what Thorn carried in his pouch. In return, Thorn rummaged around in his pouch until he came up with the remains of a sandwich, still as fresh as when he'd stuffed it into his pouch, and with a start, he realized he couldn't recall when it was. He broke off a chunk for Mulroon, smaller ones for Frangine and Rule, kept what was left for himself. Tomatoes and cheese with a strip of marinated meat, flavored in basil from his own garden. Corn was the crop that always drove him crazy, he mused. It thrived in his rich bottomland, and in good years would quickly grow higher than he could reach to harvest. He shook his head. He could no more banish memories than aches, but he'd gotten ferociously adept at ignoring both. Mulroon was speaking. He decided to focus wholly on that. You're in rare mood, Drumheller. What's that supposed to mean? No more'n what it says. Don't think I've seen a humor in you since, hell, I think it was when we first met. A dozen years and more. Nearly so. How so, Jasso? You're alive, bucko. Top to bottom, in and out. There's a sparkle to your eyes and a passion about you. Tell you truth, Thorn Drumheller, that's a sight worth the wait for it. Stop. I'm talking serious, man. Known ye since the cataclysm, been like walking with a ghost. The form of life and a fair bit of the function. Precious little soul, maybe when there is a healing to be done, but none time else. Never seen anyone build so strong and higher a wall around themselves. He sighed, a hearty gust of breath from a face dark with sympathy and sorrow. Course, it ain't seen anyone in such pain neither. A pause for emphasis. Nor fear. That bad? Not for me to say. That bad. It was the healing smashed the wall, Jasso. First the trooper's horse, then the land itself about the scar. I don't think I'd ever used so much power before, or had to give so much of myself. There was too much at stake. I couldn't hold back anything. Fair enough. Strikes me. You heal the sick and yourself, all to go. They were my dearest friends. There should have been a way to save them. Mayhap was, but you didn't know is all. No crime in that, Drumheller, not even shame. I don't expect a young'un on this first cruise to know a taste of a rogue win or how to handle it, nor a rogue deal or how to keep it from going wrong. Their job's to watch and learn. That applies to wizards too, I suspect. If that's not good enough for you, though, a casual flick of the wrist sent the stiletto from his hand to the table before Thorn had enough force to sink the blade an inch deep into its polished surface. If you miss your friends so much, then by all means join 'em. I'm not the only one in a rare mood, evidently. Not so rare lately. Be part of the world, Thorn, or find one more suited. Your friends need you whole. Go on. There's a scent in the air, Drumheller. A taint the rivers where they touch. Angwin Bay. Trouble's coming. Those damnable hounds are part of it. Thorn held out his mug for a refill and said nothing. If it hadn't been for the attack on Saganac, Mulroon went on, opening the real door of the cabin and stepping out onto the deck, leaning crossed arms on the cabin roof to strike an ostensibly casual pose. Watching, Thorn saw the captain's gaze sweep one bank, then the other, then the water ahead. Even the smallest ripples caught the big man's eye. Every scrap of movement had to be judged with its intensity normally reserved for wartime. I was planning to come for you on the road, and then close down the station. No more profits in it? Not hardly. Each season's been better than the one before. I'm pulling the lot. Everything. You're afraid. Mulroon looked honestly surprised. The thought hadn't even occurred to him. Aye, he said in simple acknowledgement. I didn't think that was possible. You haven't looked. And when Thorn asked for more, there's change on the wind. Everyone's a bit of awareness can sense it. All this damn babble about Elora Danan. He smiled, but there was no mirth in his expression. Suppose I'm no different than those folks who fled your land after Tirslane was destroyed, except I'm not waiting for the disaster. Have you no faith in the sacred princess? A working man has faith in what he can see and what he can touch. The knowledge in his head, the skill in his hands. I'm a sailor. I know the sea, and I know the sky. I'm a merchant. I know goods. I'm a chief of my clan. That means most of all, I know people. And I've learned these past months I can't trust any of it. If there's that big a storm coming, Drumheller, I want my folk out of it. Take 'em to a safe harbor and hunker down till it blows past. And if there's no safe harbor? Pray the worst of it passes us by. She's a girl, nothing more. Spent her whole damn life in that tower the king built her in Angwin, trotted out when it's convenient for state occasions and the like. I know storms, my friend, and the ships I chose to face them in. She may look the part, Drumheller, good and glorious as spun gold, but I wouldn't count on her to see me through a sunset breeze. Chapter 3. In all the world, so Garin told Thorn with pardonable pride, there was no city finer than Angwin. Certainly Mulroon conceded no finer harbor. Off the sunset ocean, you pass through King's Gate, between a pair of towering headlands, and into a bay that many considered a small sea in its own right. Deep water for near 100 miles up and down the coast, behind the seaboard range, and for 20 miles inland. 3 great rivers made their terminus here, one above the gate, the others below, allowing easy access to virtually the entire continent west of the Spinal Range. And because of the depth of the water within the bay, there was no problem with silting. Channels stayed clear and stable over the course of a season, over the course of a man's lifetime. Gateway to both land and ocean here was a natural place to trade. They'd been established settlements since the dawn of memory, the Daikini being merely the latest to plant roots and sink foundations. Easily a dozen cities, new and old, great and small, living and long dead, were scattered about the bay, as well as more villages that could be counted. Yet a body could still cast an eagle eye shoreward at any point and find a stretch of land as pristine and unspoiled as the day it was made. Angwin was where all the elements came together. Named for the ancient fortress of legend reputedly situated on the opposite headland, the city benefited from the far easier access by both land and water. The one up the rangy southern peninsula formed between bay and ocean, the other across a gently sloping shoreline hospitable to craft of any size. The same couldn't be said for its rival, the northern peninsula, a wilder, far more elemental setting where cliffs reared straight up from the water like fortress walls, sheer, forbidding crags that topped better than 1,000 feet in places. It was thickly forested, old growth, and sacred. The trees are as formidable as the ground they stood on. There were no man-made paths, though that wilderness and permission was only rarely given to follow the trails that did exist. The folk there, none of them human, liked their privacy and had little interest in the affairs of the hustling, bustling Daikini come lately across the way, which in turn ceded effective control over gate and bay to the sovereign of Angwin. Over generations, the royal family used that advantage to build a state of unsurpassed wealth and power, renowned throughout the Daikini realms on this side of the world. They called themselves High King of Land and Sea, but if some thought that hubris, none had yet challenged it. Thorn and his companions had a quick passage downriver, doing better in a week than Garand had on horseback in 3. The trooper proved an amiable companion. Within a day, he was volunteering for odd chores. He could peel potatoes as well as any of the crew, and only needed to be given instructions once, and Mulroon wasn't about to refuse the offer of extra pair of trained eyes on sentry watch. The shipmaster kept his boat in midstream all along the upper reaches of the river until they were well past the ruined trading town of Saganac. He didn't anchor for the night either, but instead trusted the Wyrn to act as pilots and to keep the boat safe from grounding. Thorn took advantage of the journey to put his own personal house in order, a task as welcome to his companions as to himself. It was long overdue. The beard was the first to go, the sight of bare cheeks and chin a startlement to him after the decade and more under cover. There were hollows he didn't remember, but likewise a strength to the underlying bone structure that was also new to him. His hair he decided mainly to leave alone, aside from a good trim to neaten its length, and some serious and regular brushing to work out an ungodly mess of knots and tangles. He kept the braids as well, in memorial to one lost friend, and his hair's autumnal coloring as for the other, and for the first time in what seemed an age, he smiled, honestly and truly, at his memories of them. It wasn't the battles he recalled, alone in Mulroon's cabin. The evening breeze set the boat to creaking and groaning, reminding him of the little grunts and groans an old man makes trying to settle himself comfortably to bed for the night. The river gurgled alongside, keel and rudder churned its smell, hissing wake behind them to mark their passing. It was their laughter that came most easily to him, the delight each took in tangling with the other, testing their wits as enthusiastically and joyfully as they did their skill with swords. Mad Mardigan was a hair better with the blade, but Sorsha had no equal on horseback. He could dance, but she had a way with songs that could set a room alight with passion or make a heart break. His personality shone with such blazing determination that there appeared no room in him for shadow, even though Thorn knew it was there. The shadow in Sorsha's soul, though, was plain for all to see. The outsider, they seemed like polar opposites, with absolutely nothing in common. Thorn knew better, that in fact they were the most kindred of souls, fulfilled and made whole by the love they'd found for each other. It wasn't just happiness that sparked between them, but joy. He missed them terribly, and yet, looking their memories full in the face after so long denying their existence, he found what he should have realized all along, that they weren't really gone. He dreamed of them at night, and Kaya, and the children, and slept more soundly and more peacefully than he had since he last saw them. As promised, Mulroon placed them in good hands. A close cousin, one of the senior captains of his clan, Fair winds and a fast current made the last leg of their voyage from the fork of the Maraguay an uneventful echo of the first. Strangely, only a single weir worked the boat, a young male, the equivalent, Thorn decided, of Garen's age, named Rin Taxamanian, and Thorn noted the others of his seagoing kind were increasingly few and far between in the water as they approached the bay. The brownies saw him and the Dakis, the ranking weir on the Malrum's vessel, who held the post of second mate, talking while Thorn and Garen were moving from one boat to the other, a conversation punctuated by sidelong glances in Thorn's direction. There was no chance to ask what was all about, but by the time the brownies reported that they'd seen to Thorn, the two boats were well on their separate ways, and after Rin kept his distance from the Noan. He was always in sight, though, and Thorn suspected always watching. Rin's natural pose was to stand slightly hunched in on himself, thus making it hard to determine more than a sense of his true height, which Thorn guessed was also of a piece with Garen's. Sleek, lustrous mahogany fur, equally camouflaged shape and strength, he had a human arrangement of limbs, although not quite in human proportions, most notably for living, questing eyes and fingers to match. The brownies' opinion was that he was as natural a pickpocket as they, though of course in no way their equal. He wore no weapons that Thorn could see, nor clothes. His sole adornment was a satchel slung casually off his shoulder and across his body. There wasn't much bulk to him, the Daikini Pathfinder cut by far the more imposing figure, but Rin carried himself with an ease of a trained distance swimmer, his power focused in his shoulders and legs. He was at home in the shrouds or on deck as in the water, which was saying quite a lot, and his surface air of madcap abandon belied a fundamental maturity that was far outstripped his years. His role aboard that of a common sailor, yet from the measure Thorn had taken him, Thorn could have assumed him to be the captain or mate. The Nelwyn took a taste of the river himself and regularly smelled the breeze with his own nostrils and the eagle's as well, just to be sure, but found none of the taint Malrun had spoken of. That bothered him. Never for a moment did he doubt his friend's word, nor the big man's sensitivity. The lack of Wyrn was proof of both, but in absolute terms, his own awareness was far greater. A taint for Malrun should have been like a stench to Thorn, yet he sensed nothing. They thought the keelboat large, but there was no comparison between it and the ocean-capable Dremen they were aboard now. 3 times the length of Malrun's vessel, displacing hundreds of tons on the score or so of Malrun's keelboat, each of its 2 masts supporting a huge triangular lateen sail, whose yards were themselves longer than the masts were tall. She was built to carry tremendous weight of cargo through the roughest of seas. The line of the hull was carved like a scimitar blade from its elegantly raked prow, built close to the water up to the looming stern castle. Here, as on river, Wyrn normally served in a multitude of capacities. They acted as pilots. They watched the vagaries of wind and water, warning well in advance of storms that might threaten the ship or keeping it from being becalmed. They made sure to keep the hull swept clean of barnacles and other marine growth. They were an integral part of the ship's defenses, and their greater-than-Daikini strength made them a godsend when it came to humping cargo. Water was their element as much as the Kaskanis, where one lived and the other made the livelihood. The smartest move the 2 nations ever made was to forge the age-old alliance between them. The Drummond's captain, Morog, had been a sailor since she was old enough to walk a deck. She knew the bay better than the rooms of her own house. Hardly surprising, Thorn heard her husband mutter, since she spends more time in the damn water than she does at home. But the absence of the Wyrn had left her uncharacteristically edgy and cautious. "Anyone but Malrun had asked," she told Thorn. "I'd have waited." Her square-cut islander features would be considered plain by those whose only interest was cosmetic. Sun and sea had textured her skin, which paradoxically made her emerald eyes gleam all the more brightly, and years of hard work in the worst kinds of weather had left marks that no amount of makeup would hide. "I'm grateful." He threw the bones, gathered them up. "Been an age since I was home," She meant the Cascani archipelago, a scattering of rugged sea mounts that began 2 days' hard sailing up the coast and stretched beyond the icelands in the far north. Hard country begetting fierce people, rovers and raiders respected by all the domains and feared by more than a few. Visits long overdue. Mulroon said much the same. Another shake of the bones in his cupped hands, another fling into the polished teak of the cabin roof they were sitting on. Don't have this knack for spotting a storm, but I learned early to follow his lead, and I'll be through the gate with the sun. When will you be back? You'll probably know better than me. Thanks to these, you mean? He twirled a bone between thumb and forefinger, shook them out again. Don't mean a blessed thing. Fortune ladies in the market. They all say different. Morag's smile told him how much faith she had in such assurances. The High Aldwin gave them to me. He was a true wizard, the shaman of our vale. Didn't mean anything for him either, but they looked impressive when he needed to buttress some pronouncement or other. Fake then, are they? Does the crown make the king any more or less monarch? The power comes from within, he used to tell me. Sometimes the wielder needs a talisman to focus it through. They say Sherlinger's wand. Others, it's the audience that needs something, an anchor for the faith. They rather look to those wee bits than their sorcerer. He has the tools. Thorn's smile matched hers. He must know his business. Saw a man once, wore the finest set of steel made, a blade of wonder, molded plate armor that gave him the body of a god. But that sword in his hands, he couldn't find the wall of a barn from the inside to do it damage, yet the finest knight I ever knew, and the finest friend I knew in a crow's cage. Myself, Nelwyn, I like a world where things are what they seem. Not less than I, shipmaster. So where's your girl fall into all this, hey? Thorn looked up and over, suddenly conscious of Rin's eyes, not for the first time during the voyage. The weir listened more than he talked and watched more than he listened, reminded Thorn disconcertingly of himself. When he spoke, it was all surface, glib and for effect, mainly to make those around him laugh. In truth, he said very little. Their gaze met, and Rin lit out for the masthead, apparently taking on himself the role of lookout, as though that had been his intentions all along. The grace of a cat, muttered Thorn, not with some admiration, and twice the self-possession. Makes you want to kill him somewhat, Morag noted in partial agreement. Good with crew, good with cargo, well worth his wages. But still only a seaman? Freelancer. The way Morag said it, that was a dirty word. Never stays on one ship long enough to make a proper place for himself. Works where he pleases, which is damnably rare. Masters and mates have to be more constant, like a good harness team. He was too much wanderlust in his soul. Then, without a beat or pause, you near answer my question, Drumheller, about your girl. Her accent produced a word sounding more like gel. No, I didn't. But the captain wasn't about to take no as an answer. She's the stuff of legend. That provoked a rude comment. A dozen realms, shipmaster, of flesh and spirit, sunlight and veil, mortal and immortal, all claiming aspects of this life, this globe for their own. Been that always, Nelwyn? So what? Some races grow older, others grow up. We begin to grow each other. We begin to crowd each other. It's a big It's a big world, man. You speak reality. I mean, perception. In the barrows, you hear complaints of too many daikini. Among the daikini, why do those veil folk insist on placing cages about the limits of our lives? Mulroon said that there's there's the stench of change in the air that scares people. Too many, and he smiled without humor, are casting bones and seeing only bones. And your girls? Thrust of her jaw forward and still distant skyline of Angwin, dominated by flat-topped needle of a tower, going to make a difference? According to prophecy. Which is fine, assuming that's a contract all the parties feel bound by. He heard, but he wasn't really listening. It was planting time, in memory, the hardest days of the year, that saw him up before dawn in bed well past sunset, working his plow up one furrow and down the next, turning the earth, sowing seeds, a part of him wishing his growing power could do this work for him, or provide for his family without all the work at all. A true temptation. Wave a hand, speak the right words, and fill the house with gold enough to last a score of lifetimes. And cast away all this, he remembered muttering, caked with dirt and sweat, as he muscled the plow around to follow the pig that pulled it. It was a late evening, the night of the cataclysm, though who was to know it then? The moon waning as he sat beneath a shade tree at the house, muscles too stressed and weary to propel him inside, when he glanced upward to find the high Aldwin standing behind him. He didn't think the old Nelwyn could move so stealthily, or that he could be caught so unawares. "You've not gone to Tierslin," the Aldwin said, without preamble. He meant for Elora Danan's birthday. "No. You were invited." "I have responsibilities," a wave of the hand to encompass the fields. "Are you wizard, then, or farmer?" There was some beer left in a jug, though nothing of supper to eat. Thorn pulled a mugful for the Aldwin and invited him to sit. It was a lovely night, and the sky a breathtaking tapestry of stars, its vault more crowded, each shining more brilliantly than he'd ever noted before. The air was warm without being sultry, leavened by a gentle breeze that brought with it a myriad of scents from his wife's garden by the house and the woods beyond. "I am what I am," he said at last, because, whether he knew in his heart he was the one, he refused to concede that it meant he could no longer be the other. "Ah," the Aldwin noted sagely, "a lawyer, then." "Is the answer so important?" "If you are not true to yourself, how can you be true to your power, and the responsibility that comes with it?" "I am being true." "You're godfather to Elora Danan." "I was husband and father long before." "When you were a farmer, not a wizard." "What do you want here? What do you want with me?" The Aldwin held up a scrap of cloth. It was frayed all around the edges like something stripped unfinished from the weaver's loom. As Thorn watched, the threads all appeared to tear away, one from the other, unraveling before his eyes and fading away until all that remained in the Aldwin's outheld hand was empty air. "The fabric of our world no longer holds," was the old Nelwyn's quiet pronouncement. "Our world, young wizard, the world of makers and doers. It wears through, it tears, it ceases to be." There was a hollowness in his voice, as though the Aldwin had looked into the abyss to behold something so awful that he could no more express it than comprehend it, except in vague, oblique generalities, because to even attempt to do so would be more than any living mind or soul could endure. "We Nelwyns are small folk. We take up very little space in the land or the scheme of things, content to do no harm, in hopes that the same will be returned to us." The Aldwin's tone, the ravaged nature of his eyes, made plain his fear that those days were done. "If such is no longer sufficient to protect us, then we have no business making this place our home." "What are you saying?" "The farmer has his path, the wizard another. Each offers its joy, each demands a price." "Why are you telling me this? I made my choice." "I know." The Aldwin leaned over to pat his hand lightly, and he snapped it back, close to his body as if it had been flashed by an open flame. "I just wanted to remind you. I'm sorry," he said at last, as the call from the house distracted Thorn. His wife, concerned because of the lateness of the hour, wanted him to come in to dinner and to bed. When he looked back, he was alone, with nothing to mark the Aldwin's presence save the scrap of cloth he held. There wasn't a mar on it. He held a perfect handkerchief of finely woven cotton, hems neatly closed, emblazoned with his own sigil. Later that night came an explosion in the sky so great that all the village throughout the world thought the world was done. Strange lights, fierce winds, a display no one would ever forget. Thorn saw none of it. Bare moments after waking, he was struck by a pain through his heart so great, he was sure he would die of it, that stretched his jaws as wide as they would go and peeled lips from teeth as though he were a beast gone mad. He made no sound. His lungs were as paralyzed and as frozen as his heart. He couldn't move either, just sit upright on the side of his bed with eyes wide, face twisted into a monster mask like the kind of children made for a trick-or-treat hauntings. Kaya, snuggled close behind him, knew nothing of this, even when he threw aside the covers and hobbled to the window, graceless as an ancient. There was a faint, acrid tang to the morning twilight that made the mist of the river seem more like the smoke of some great fire. He knew Tirasleen was gone. As surely as he knew the fact of his own life, he knew that his friends were lost to him, as he knew his family soon would be. The High Aldwin met him at the door. "Everyone's afraid," the old Nelwyn said by way of greeting. "Except mine," was Thorn's reply. "And that's because they don't know yet. Can you feel? The earth." His face worked as he tried to wrap words around concepts far vaster than they were designed for. "By all the blessed powers, it's so badly hurt it can't even scream." "Nor could you." "What's happened?" The Aldwin bowed his head, stubby fingers working the knotted braids of his beard as though they were worry beads. "I don't know," he confessed at last. "And glad I am of it." "I have to." And then in that same numbed voice with the false calm that meant the hurt and grief hadn't yet been set in, "I should have been there." "And add more graves to the boneyard. Now there's a worthy ambition." "I was supposed to be there." His voice faltered, becoming that of a schoolboy making excuses. "It's just the harvest took longer than I thought. I knew the others would understand. I hoped Elora would as well." He stepped over the threshold, looking at his fields. The trees that framed them on one side, the river that did the same on the other, the house that formed the centerpiece of the setting, and, he believed until this moment, his life. "I thought it was a dream," he said, after filling his lungs to bursting with air that tasted deliciously sweet. He looked back to his teacher. "I was at Tirasleen last night. I rode there on the back of a dragon. I thought it was a dream," he repeated. "They represent the greatest of powers, dragons do, the quintessence of all that is magic," the Aldwin said. "To see one, that's either the greatest of blessings or of curses." "I have to go," Thorn said. "No," came from the other, and in the shadow of the morning twilight he no longer appeared old to Thorn's eyes, but eternal, as if some primal force of nature had suddenly made flesh. "You don't." "I have a responsibility." "To hearth and home, above all else. That's the Nelwyn way. We are small folk. We live small lives. We work small magics." "I can't think like that." "Our strength is our community." Thorn began. "I guess I have a larger vision of what that community is. The dragon showed me the true face of the world," he explained. "His world. It doesn't have to be yours." "How can I deny what my own eyes have beheld? What heart and soul haven't learned? A friend is a friend. I turn my back on one. I turn my back on myself." "Noble sentiments. They will cost you." "They already have." "You should have been content with parlor tricks." "Better than to have never been born. I'm a wizard." His mouth worked a few moments longer, but nothing uttered forth. He'd said all there was to say. "Your family would be safe. You need to have no worries on that score." But when Thorn framed his next question, the Aldwin held up a hand for silence. "Best you not know the how or wherefore. To your ignorance lies our sanctuary." The old Nelwyn held out a hand, a belt with two fair-sized pouches attached. Thorn's traveling kit, plus a satchel stuffed with clothes. Thorn couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, back into the house, and with it almost went a thought to his wife, to call her to his side for a formal embrace. "Are you a farmer or a wizard?" the Aldwin challenged, and there was nothing gentle in his voice, nor any mercy either. "If the one, then bind your fate to us. Accept the pattern of our ways, as they have always been." "No." "Then you have no place here." His words have the force of a ritual pronouncement, his mind that of a magistrate passing sentence. "And the longer you tarry, the greater the danger to all you hold most dear." "Tell them I love them," Thorn said as he looked to his belt. "If they remember nothing else about you, young wizard, that will ever remain." "Damn my eyes," he heard loudly from Garin to break his reverie. In a tone that mingled wonder and disbelief, he blinked hurriedly, his eyes overflowing with tears, and was silently grateful when one of the brownies pressed a kerchief into his hand. He knew without looking that it was the square the Aldwin had given him, and though it fitted as he wiped his cheeks and blew his nose. He'd never looked at all those memories before. He'd locked away the whole portion of his life, thinking that by denying them, he might also deny what had happened, or at least deaden the awful pain. He opened this huge void within his heart and used it like a rubbish pit for all the parts of himself he felt he couldn't bear, ignoring the facts that time was turning it and him to rot. As Malrum had made plain, he'd been killing himself inside while going through the motions of existence, in the ultimate hope that death might someday claim him altogether, building such walls around himself that neither friend nor force could ever again do him harm. Imagine his surprise to discover that the pain could be borne, and that with it, as a balance, came memories of joy. Not only was I mad, he muttered to himself, I was a fool. And us, eh? Cheered Frangine. We're witness to both. What's my life, then? Is complete. What's Garin nattering about? Before the brownie could reply, Morag called out to the Daikini. Hoy, trooper! She spoke quietly, the same volume she'd used with Thorn at her side, yet Garin, all the way across the deck and staring at the approaching shore, snapped his head around as if he were a fish snagged tight in her line. Ma'am? D'you know how it is on horseback, but when you ride the waves, you be careful with your words. There's powers aplenty to hear a curse like that and give you what you ask for. And that's enough and hardly what you want. Powers I thought too great to bother with the words of a mortal, Thorn mused. Aye, so I used to think myself, but I tell you, Malrum's friend, there's a wildling loose that bears no love to anything that breathes. Thorn sensed no specific meaning to the term she used. It may have been a force or a person. All that mattered to Morag was that it was trouble. The big woman shook her head. Mayhap anything at all but be me own willies. Tell me when it's safe. I'll tell you when I'll be back. I like a world where things are what they seem, he offered, her own words back at her. So, bucko, what's the fuss then? She demanded. Garin, who bridled at the appellation. Where are you sounding your mouth? That column of horses along the shore road Are they who I think? Aye, Morag told him, swirling a whole host of negatives to that single word. Thunder Riders. Here? Thorn noted dryly. These days it seems everyone is a long way from home. Heard of them, I have, said Garin, proceeded to show off what he knew. They hail from the plains beyond the stairs to heaven. 3 great rivers, defined to the sunset shore as this end of the continent was known, and 2 mountain ranges as well. One was the Continental Divide, where Garin had found Thorn, though there was a lesser range right along the coast, given the impression that back when the world had yet to assemble into its final form, a monster wave had hurled itself against the shore with such force that the land was shoved backward into the bunched-up jumble to form a barrier wall of phalanx peaks. The last, at most magnificent, however, went the other way, perpendicular to the divide along the Sun Road from east to west, and were named the Stairs to Heaven because the peaks stood too high and proud to be believed. The greatest river in the world, the legendary Gillibrae, sprang from its heart. In a land of such natural superlatives, it was small wonder the warrior race who claimed it from their birthplace considered none that lived their equals. According to story, Garin continued, they got no proper home. Born on horseback, they live with what they can carry and no more. When the thunder rides, it leaves desolation as its trail, he finished formally. They wear eagle feathers, Drumheller. Annel's voice bloomed suddenly in Thorn's mind. Her tone was cold, deliberately stripped of all emotion. So have others we have known, Annel, he replied in silent speech as well. Thorn heard an outcry, made thin by wind and distance because she was so high, and all the more passionate because of it. Grief and rage bundled tightly together. He saw a flash of movement, no more than a dark dot really, against the azure canopy of the sky, no way to see the details without his spyglass, and when he tried to shift to her mind, he found himself blocked violently away. He sprang to his feet and hurried to the Drummond's forepeak, never taking his eyes off the eagle, trusting to others to get out of his way. He had a vague recollection of a slight collision with somebody's rump as a fair scattering of profanities, but he didn't really care. His focus was wholly on Annel as she tucked wings tight to her body and stooped for the shore. She was attacking like a falcon, only she was the size of a Daikini child, with strength and speed to match. A decent sideswipe of her wings could break bones, and she could wield her claws as effectively as a warrior could his sword. Thorn shifted attention to the shore, thoughts racing through the catalog of options for a ploy that wouldn't actually make things worse. But when he cast his insight toward the troop, he found himself bounced away again. "Bloody hell!" he pronounced in astonishment. "They have a shield wall," he thought, "and a damn fine one in the bargain." He had no doubts he could break it. He also had no doubts that the act would attract more attention than he was prepared to deal with at the moment. Fortunately, that fractional contact had given him at least a decent look at the riders' faces. They'd seen the eagle, heard her cry, were watching her madcap descent. Bows were already in hand and arrows nocked. The troop had split into 3 distinct sections, each moving smoothly apart from the other. One would bear the brunt of Enel's charge. They would take the casualties, and thereby leave the others a clear shot at her when she pulled up and away. Powerful as the eagle was, she was also at her most vulnerable in a climb, beating against the pull of gravity. The riders were already celebrating their triumph, eagle feathers all around. They reckoned without Bastion. He and Enel had mated young, and mated for life, and he wasn't about to lose her. He blew out his wings so close in front of her, seemed to all watching that there was no way to avoid a horrible collision that would send both birds crashing into the water. Yet she merely threw wide a wing of her own and tucked herself around him in a brutally tight pivot, which was precisely what Bastion had intended, because the maneuver not only bled off a fair piece of her dive velocity, it had also left her in a level flight, headed away from shore. The waiting troopers didn't like that one bit. A few tried their luck with arrows, none came remotely close, although when Garen offered a raucous cheer at the eagle's escape, a small volley let fly toward Morag's Drummond. One bolt struck home, right at the end of its travel, managing to snag its head in the railing within arm's reach of Thorn. "Bastards!" snarled Garen, and then much louder, "Bloody bastards!" "If you don't antagonize people," Thorn told him, "they're less likely to throw things." "Ain't afraid of the likes of them." "More fool you, then. We're not talking fear anyway, Pathfinder, but respect." Thorn hefted the bolt, ironwood, a defense relative of oak, ideal for pike staffs, and crossbows, a broad bodkin bolt designed to penetrate both plate armor and mail. He noted barbs at random places in the point to tear the flesh going in, nothing compared with the damage it would do when it was removed. "Crisis is past," Morag told him as he returned aft, both of them watching the eagles beat their way back to the altitude, Bastion making sure to keep himself between his mate and her prospective targets. "Though, if I'm any judge, he'll na find welcome aboard for a wheel while." "They'd have killed her," Thorn said, allowing some of his own outrage to show. "They knew how. They'd have practiced. She could see all that." "And it didn't matter Tinker's wet dam. Wild times, Drumheller. They touch us all in ways we cannot catch imagine. If the king brought in the likes of them," a grim jet of her chin toward the shore where the troop had reformed and was now pacing them, "for his precious celebration, I'll be glad to see the back of him and his precious Angwin, like swimming in a shark pit, and if they've come on their own, be hard put to say what is worse." "Drumheller!" "Yes, Bastion." The eagle's tone was strained, as though he was shouting his message from the middle of a fight, which was probably the case. "I'm taking Enel across the gate to the forests of Old Angwin. There are old nests, good hunting, bright water. We'll hear you when you call." "Is Enel all right?" He heard a rueful chuckle. "In as fine a fighting form as ever I've seen her." "I've never seen her so upset. These 2-legs like us for their standards. Common enough practice the world over. Your kind aren't noble creatures. They don't merely use our image, Drumheller. They take us in our prime. They take us in blood, and use that blood to bind our spirits to their own, in much the same way the Daikini child was lashed to the hounds. To earn a feather, one of our kind must be taken alive and ritually butchered. No simple task, I grant you. Only few among them would ever make an attempt, and even less succeed. We, in turn, marked them well, and made certain our paths would rarely cross. In 100 years, only one Myzen had claimed the prize of such a hunt, and that is the current Castellan Modri. A whole nest he took, parents and offspring, with nothing but the stench of sorcery to speak of how the slaughter was accomplished. Since his ascension, they have hunted us with the tenacity of death dogs, and used any means possible to drag us down. You wonder why we suddenly grown so few. These riders are the reason. I'm sorry. For those who ride the thunder, Drumheller, we have no mercy. I understand. I'll miss your company, my friends, and try my best not to need you. Ah, thanks. Idiot! Frangine fumed from his hidey-hole under Thorn's collar, once Thorn had passed along the news. Better you should have asked them to take us along. I'll call them back, Frangine, for you and Rule. Determined to play the hero, the brownie made his exasperation plain. I'll have to see how Elora's turned out. After 60 years, your concern is touching, Master Drumheller. And your tongue is far more cutting than usual. Those riders have marked you, mage, even if you're too head-blind to notice. The boy may have been making all the noise, but it was you their eyes were on. You saw that? The eagles, Frangine said with prim pride. Aren't they the only ones blessed with sharp sight? Go with them. Stay with Morag. He hurried on, intent on making his point. It's the same to us so long as we pass England by. You're afraid too? Careful, was the correction. Cautious, wary, all our size, a matter of survival. You're not so big yourself. You should learn from us. I've never heard you talk this way. You've never been so hell-bent on waking a bear from snow sleep. Elora is as much a talisman for me as anyone. I need to see her. You don't even listen to yourself speak the truth. Drumheller, why expect anything different from us? I don't understand. What? Revelation! The brownie grabbed one of Thorn's braids, using it like a climber to swing outward and balance himself on the point of Thorn's chin. One hand claiming tight hold on the length of hair, while he waved the other in a clenched fist. He was too close for Thorn to focus comfortably, but the intensity of the elegant little creature's fury held him in place as though he was manacled. Tell me, Thorn the Mighty, Thorn the Magus! Frangine challenged in a sing-song tone that was an eerie parody of the High Aldwins. Stop it! Thorn might have been shouting at the sun to stop it rising. Which finger contains the power of the universe? Stop it! He swept the brownie free of his perch and held him, the pair of them exchanging glares like duelists crossing swords. You're hurting, Thorn, Frangine said softly. Be thankful I don't do worse. Morag had altered course to take her Drummond further out into the channel. It may have been a lucky shot that struck, but she was in no mood to learn different the hard way. The wind had shifted as well, the lateen yards turning with it just enough to block Thorn's view of shore from his perch on the aft cabin as he set his companion aside. He could cross to the railing, but it stood higher than he. There was nothing convenient to stand on, and he had no desire to dangle his arms like some would-be monkey. So, instead, he made his way to the steering post to rejoin Morag. Another few points to starboard, she said conversationally, is all it'll take to clear the harbor. Then it's through the gate and away home. He knew Morag had seen his argument with Frangine and was thankful she let it pass. Generally speaking, sailors are as fond of the wee folk as brownies are of open water, which is to say, not at all. And out of respect and courtesy, Mulroon would have told her of Thorn's companions. That way, had there been a problem, it would have been resolved long before Thorn came aboard, thus sparing all parties any undue awkwardness. By the same token, though, Thorn kept them out of sight. This had been a breach of courtesy, but he didn't know how to apologize. Could you spare a dinghy? That way you'd be less at risk. She looked at him straight on with a directness of manner that marked both family and profession. It was how Mulroon dealt with people, and Thorn had learned how good captains did. Could, she agreed. Won't, shan't do, she called out to her mate, who was also her husband. Break out the house colors. Why for, Morag? Thorn asked her. I want no mistakes or accidents. I want all to know who's coming. That way, those riders start something, they'll know full well who they're starting it with. There was a stiff breeze, so the moment the huge pennants were running up their respective yards, they snapped out to their full length. We going to a fight? Asked Garin. Different set of rags entire, Shando told him. House berth, Morag? We own it, don't we? You're as welcome at my table as Mulroon's, Drumheller. I appreciate that, shipmaster. So come then. He smiled and shook his head. Daft, are ye? Too damnable daft to know better, piped up Frangine in a voice to be heard. Could be the wee one has a point, Morag agreed, but her smile faded. All jollity fled when Thorn turned his eyes on her. I saw the greatest fortress in 1,000 ages, perhaps the greatest since old England itself turned to wasteland. I've seen a score of other sites on this globe, all places of power, where they ley lines intersect, savaged just as badly. For all the time, I've no idea why or what or even if there was a who responsible, only that it happened. In the purely physical world, there are volcanoes and earthquakes and storms. Why not in the magical one as well? A tragedy, but they happen. You wandered. You saw all that, yet you did nothing. A new voice, as rich and warm as its fur, the shape of a weir mouth, casting the words in odd accents. Thorn cast a glare at Rin, though he was more angry at himself for being taken so unawares, and a sharp one as Morag for performing such eavesdropping. Surprisingly, her response was a gesture of reassurance. The weir was as worthy of trust as she, on that she pledged her all. I did nothing, Thorn said simply in agreement. His instincts were fiercely at war within him. He had been alone so long, he'd grown unused to trust, offered or given, even from his oldest friends. Something about the weir reached out to him, but the resonance it struck still felt out of tune. The walls of Tirasleen were not just stone, and its defenders weren't armed only with wood and steel. The king had a clutch of household sorcerers led by Finrazel. There were amulets and wards galore, for the structure itself and for every person within. The Valefolk did their part as well, yet they were wiped away in a heartbeat. He took a breath, just long enough for all to know that they were utterly helpless. Another breath, the slightest shudder to it, his eyes gone hooded to hide the pain. Utterly doomed. So what's changed? What's it to you? A shrug, a hint of something beneath his facade, like a deep ocean current, the smooth surface belying a darker passion roiling far below. The death dogs, Thorn told him and Morag both. Not natural nor an accident. They were all young, you see, in their prime. These aren't leftovers from the old days. Someone whelped them, raised them, trained them, set them loose as a great hunt. Someone cast a bane on Farron to lead them after a specific target. That someone may still be mostly shadow, but now I know it's there. With nary a care, he heard from beneath his pocket, again in a voice loud enough to carry, of what'll happen then. Could be as a point, Rin echoed. No doubt about it, Thorn nodded. It doesn't matter. He was thinking aloud more for his own benefit than his companions. Death dogs after me, Mizon after the eagles, and the tenacity of death dogs and the ferocity to match. Sorcery links them both, Mizon and Engwyn, Elora and Engwyn. Something changed the behavior from the Mizon. They were cruel to begin with, now they appear more so. You have to wonder why, and who's responsible. You have nothing, Wanderer. Rin scoffed, mainly to observe Thorn's response, which was a shrug as offhand as the weirs had been earlier. Random elements without connection. Pieces of a puzzle, Thorn corrected. Whether they belong to the same puzzle, and what that puzzle means, that's yet to be learned, which I won't do saying on this boat, however much I might prefer it. Then be set with your gear, Drumheller, said Morag. Tide will be turning when we dock. I'm not quick away. I'm struck till tomorrow. Nobody wanted that, and he hurried to work. Farewells were brief, and Thorn couldn't help noticing that Morag and her husband and the weir swept the bustling wharf with the same focus and intensity that Mulroon had used on the riverbank days before. None wore swords, but there were knives in abundance, and he knew the bigger blades were close at hand, discreetly out of sight. Sails were loosely furled, the ship held to its mooring by only a couple of lines, and those were fully manned. One command, and the Drummond would be free. He barely touched the dock before he heard the command given. By the time he looked around, the ship had slipped its tethers altogether and moved farther from the quay than the strong man could jump. Morag and her eyes on the way ahead, Shando on the harbor behind, ready to warn her of any attack. Thorn shivered, feeling the intensity of their emotions wash over him like a cresting wave, a fear so real it was almost tangible. Whatever the cause of the islanders' apprehension, there was no evidence of it on the quay. And that is all the time I have today to read Shadow Moon by Chris Claremont and George Lucas. Thank you for spending time with us. We'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel and feel free to click the like button and share the video. Until the Infernal Brotherhood convenes again, my fellow scruffy-looking nerf herders, may the Force be with you.